Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Thought Experiments in Civilization for Thursday, 23 January 2025. This is the first episode in a new series that I'm calling Thought Experiments in Civilization, which will be a series within a series since I'm going to include it under the umbrella of Today in Philosophy of History. All my previous episodes have been more or less narrowly focused on philosophy of history. Though thought experiments in civilization will intersect with philosophy of history, it won't be focused on it. Philosophy of history and the study of civilization are adjacent disciplines, but they aren't identical. I found personally that my study of philosophy of history has given me insights into civilization, and the study of civilization yields many examples that can be used to illustrate arguments in philosophy of history, and it presents distinctive problems for philosophy of history. So, philosophy of history and the study of civilization have much to learn from each other, and each bleeds into the other. So, I'm no respecter of disciplinary boundaries, so it's fine with me that there's that ambiguity between the two of them. I have a more systematic series planned for the study of civilization, but in the meantime, I just want to get the juices flowing by thinking about civilization informally. Hegel said that philosophy of history is nothing but the thoughtful consideration of history. And I'd like these thought experiments in civilization to be nothing but the thoughtful consideration of civilization. And I think that thought experiments have a legitimate place in the study of civilization. The study of civilization remains inchoate in our time. If you prefer a Kuhnian formulation, we can say that the study of civilization is pre-paradigmatic. There is no scientific research program in civilization to define or to be defined by a paradigm. That means that civilization is, at present, a folk concept like folk psychology or folk biology. What do I mean by a folk concepts? Folk concepts are traditional pre-scientific ideas that we have about the world. We name, identify, individuate, classify, and reason about the world and parts of the world long before we formulate scientific theories about the world and parts of the world. These folk concepts hang together loosely as what we could call folk theories or folk disciplines. But as folk disciplines, they are never subject to fully scientific formalization. The most commonly referenced folk concepts are those of folk psychology. Both the Oxford Companion to Philosophy and the Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy, two of my go-to reference works, have entries on folk psychology, but not on any other folk discipline, if we can call a folk discipline a discipline at all. The wide recognition of folk psychology may be due to the early work of Wilhelm Wundt. The psychologist Wilhelm Wundt wrote Elements of Folk Psychology, originally published in German in 10 volumes between 1900 and 1920. Wundt recognized two meanings of folk psychology. The first of these was as follows, quote, "The term folk psychology was applied to investigations concerning the relations which the intellectual, moral, and other mental characteristics of peoples sustain one another, as well as to studies concerning the influence of these characteristics upon the spirit of politics, art, and literature," unquote. The second of these meanings is as follows. Another quote from Wilhelm Wundt, quote, "The mental sciences begin to realize the need of a psychological basis. Where a serviceable psychology did not exist, they felt it necessary to establish an independent psychological foundation for their work. It was particularly in connection with the problems of philology and mythology, and about the middle of the century, that the idea gradually arose of combining into a unified whole the various results concerning the mental development of man as severally viewed by language, religion, and custom," unquote. Neither of these meanings are precisely the meaning attached to folk psychology today, but Wundt was right to be casting about for a meaning because experimental scientific psychology was beginning to develop in his time, and it was distinct from traditional thinking about psychology. It was becoming necessary to distinguish between pre-theoretical psychology and the newly scientific psychology. And it's not just psychology that's involved here. Robert Andrew Wilson and Frank C. Kyle in the MIT Encyclopedia of the Cognitive Sciences identified folk biology as follows, quote, folk biology is the cognitive study of how people classify and reason about the organic world. Humans everywhere classify animals and plants into species-like groups, as obvious to a modern scientist as to a Maya Indian, unquote. Daniel Dennett in The Intentional Stance identified a folk physics, quote, in one sense, people knew what magnets were. They were things that attracted iron long before science told them what magnets were. A child learns what the word magnet means not typically by learning an explicit definition, but by learning the folk physics of magnets, in which the ordinary term magnet is embedded or implicitly defined as a theoretical term, unquote. We can see that the idea of folk concepts as pre-scientific concepts is applicable throughout all branches of knowledge and is a part of the shift from traditional knowledge to scientific knowledge. This has already been made explicit by William Andrew Rotschaffer in his The Biology of and Psychology of Moral Agency, in which he wrote, quote, there is good evidence that we have or had folk physics, folk chemistry, folk biology, folk botany, and so on. What has happened to these folk endeavors? They seem to have given way to scientific accounts, unquote. Rotschaffer not only identifies folk physics, folk chemistry, folk biology, and folk botany, but also suggests that these folk concepts have given way to scientific concepts. Folk concepts giving way to scientific concepts could take the form of a passive or unconscious process, or it could take the form of an active and purposeful process. In an unconscious process, we might imagine scientists simply preferring the new scientific concepts they have formulated to the earlier folk concepts. As a purposive process, we have a name for this, eliminationism or eliminativism. An eliminativist stand on folk psychology, for example, holds that our folk concepts employed in psychology are so flawed and so irredeemable that we have to eliminate them, all of them, and start with a clean slate. We start over for science from square one. This was a powerful idea for a time, and it still is a powerful idea in some quarters, but a wholesale elimination of folk ways of talking about the world would result in far more confusion than clarification. A problem with eliminationism is that even if we claim to have eliminated folk concepts, they're still there in the back of our minds. Mario Bunge said that folk psychology is still there even when it's condemned, and his entry on folk psychology in his Dictionary of Philosophy says, quote, folk psychology is the one referred to by most philosophers of mind even while criticizing it, unquote. While it's true that some of our folk concepts hold us back, some of our folk concepts also have scientific promise, and as part of the evolution of science to select and to extrapolate the most intrinsically scientific concepts. Science, you can say then, is one long rational reconstruction of folk concepts, and we make progress in this rational reconstruction when we make the right selections from our folk concepts, which is never a foregone conclusion. One way to keep our cake and eat it too is to retain our folk concepts not as an integral part of a scientific theory, but at one remove, as the familiar features of our cognitive furniture, which need to be brought into relationship with a fully scientific theory. Carl Hempel proposed what he called bridge principles to meet this need, which are formulated in order to bridge the gap between folk concepts employed in ordinary language and the internal principles of scientific theories. Hempel wrote, quote, "Whatever characteristic terms a new theory introduces will have to be linked by bridged principles to an antecedently understood vocabulary that serves to describe and to express generalizations about the subject matter that the theory is to explain." Unquote. While Hempel doesn't explicitly appeal to folk concepts, he uses pre-theoretical terms in place of folk concepts, which I take to mean approximately the same thing. But not everyone was eager to eliminate folk concepts or to displace them to the outer darkness of scientific theory. Some have valued folk concepts. A.L. Kroeber, in his An Anthropologist Looks at History, wrote, quote, "Historians write without technical terms or jargon, even less than philosophers employ, and they operate with a non-technical psychology, a psychology of generic experience and common understanding. And similarly, they operate with an untechnical common man's causality, intelligible on its face, and a similar common morality. Basically, this still holds true as it did 2 or more millennia ago," unquote. Like Carl Hempel, Kroeber doesn't explicitly refer to folk concepts, but that's pretty much what he meant, I think. And for Kroeber, it's to history's advantage that it employs these folk concepts. The unscientific nature of history means that history largely consists of folk concepts formulated in ordinary language, as is also the case with the study of civilization. The attempt to get directly from folk concepts to the internal principles of a rigorous science, that's Hempel's term, the internal principles as opposed to the bridge principles. So the attempt to get directly from folk concepts to internal principles of a rigorous science is likely to fail. Hence, the importance of what Hempel called bridge principles to connect our discussions in ordinary language with our more arcane jargon of our scientific theories. The folk concepts of civilization could take any of the forms that I've described so far, talking about things like folk psychology. These folk concepts of civilization could be eliminated in favor of new technical terms that we develop in the study of civilization. The folk terms could be maintained, but outside the theory of civilization proper and related to that theory through bridge principles, as suggested by Carl Hempel. And they could be maintained, but rationally reconstructed to be consistent with an adequate theory of civilization. Often we find that folk concepts undergo all of these processes in development of a scientific discipline, since any science will involve several folk concepts, some of which might be eliminated, some of which might be retained, and some of which will be rationally reconstructed. And sometimes whether or not a concept has been retained or rationally reconstructed isn't clear. For example, we have retained the concept of light from pre-theoretical thought, and light is regarded as a legitimate concept in physics. But light has also been rationally reconstructed as part of the electromagnetic spectrum, and at a deeper level as part of fundamental physics. Light remains, moreover, a conflicted concept, as we can see in the wave-particle duality. If I take a wave-like measurement of light, I get a wave-like result. And if I take a particle-like measure of light, I get a particle-like result. We could even say that light as a theoretical concept is no less problematic than light as a folk concept because it involves these unresolved difficulties. I think all of these problems and more, or at least their parallels, will be involved in any theoretical grasp of civilization. The more time I've spent delving into the idea of civilization, the more I've come to see that the folk concepts we employ to talk about civilization, including discussions of civilization and history, are misleading. Folk concepts of civilization appeal to prevalent factors that are obvious but are not usually definitive. In other words, folk concepts of civilization appear to focus on genera rather than on differentia, to borrow the Aristotelian distinction within definitions. Take familiar ideas like agricultural civilization or industrial civilization or technological civilization. While these indicate important properties of civilizations so characterized, each term indicates a class of civilizations and so says little about what makes any particular civilization distinctive. In any case, we have to begin with the folk concepts of civilization, and that starting point with folk concepts bears upon our methodology for the study of civilization. And this is also consistent with the rational reconstruction of folk concepts. We begin with a folk concept, but the development of our inquiry will continually point to revisions which, when incorporated into the folk concept, contribute to its rational reconstruction. In any case, it's probably inevitable that we will begin with folk concepts no matter how flawed they are. And a folk concept, which we could also call an intuitive concept, requires an intuitive method for its exploration and elaboration. This is what a thought experiment provides to us, an intuitive explication of an intuitive conception of civilization. An intuitive method in the study of civilization can be the basis of our research before we've converged on a paradigm, and our reasoning can be made more formal and can benefit from the joint efforts of scholars cooperating in the same project. The absence of any shared theoretical framework for the study of civilization keeps the study of civilization a strictly limited enterprise studied by isolated individuals like Ibn Khaldun, for example. Without a shared framework, we can't bring to bear the combined efforts of large numbers of scholars over a long period of time. This common effort by scholars is what I take Imre Lakatos to have meant by a scientific research program. Our study of civilization remains below the threshold of even the most rudimentary measure of formal knowledge, as is painfully apparent by the lack of shared definitions. Because of the great many definitions of civilization in use, we may be studying different objects of knowledge and calling these different objects of knowledge civilization, so that we have the appearance but not the reality of being engaged in the same scientific research program. We could call this the definitional question, but we shouldn't let it hamstring us. It's been said that while philosophy culminates in definitions, science begins with definitions, and there is some truth to this. But the idea that we begin with philosophy, arrive at a different definition, and then use this definition in the foundation of a science is a particular philosophy of history of science, like I discussed in my episode on Haskell Fane. I'm not saying that this is wrong, only that it's not the only way to go about it. In some cases, it's better just to ignore definitions for the time being and do whatever we can do in terms of conceptual clarification without a definition. But don't get me wrong, I love a philosophically satisfying definition, but we can't always get to one. And since we have no definition of civilization that commands the assent of all competent to form an opinion, we can't say what civilization is definitively. That means we don't know the limits of the concept of civilization. Thought experiments are a way to test these limits of the concept of civilization. By coming up with imaginative scenarios for civilization, we can test how far we can push the concept of civilization before it fails or before it breaks down. At the same time, we're elaborating and extending the concept of civilization beyond its parochial limits as a folk concept. This is arguably a necessary step in formulating a scientific concept. Thought experiments can help us to see beyond the parochial limits of our folk conception of civilization by presenting us with counterfactual examples that have not existed in human history and which therefore spur us to think things through more thoroughly. So, what is a thought experiment? Let's start with an example instead of a definition. Possibly the most famous thought experiment in our time is the trolley problem. This is a thought experiment in ethics, where a trolley with no brakes is barreling down a track. It's going to run over 5 people on the track unless you pull a lever to divert the trolley to a side track, in which case it kills only 1 person instead of 5. This is intended to force us to confront utilitarian moral intuitions about the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Utilitarianism tells us that the greatest happiness for the greatest number is the proper moral standard, and some have interpreted this as meaning that in a forced choice, we should allow fewer people to get killed than allow a greater number to get killed. It's also an investigation into our personal participation in a forced choice, since the individual to whom the trolley problem is proposed is presented with a choice of whether or not to pull a lever to divert the trolley. So the individual here is implicated in an impossible moral choice. A variant on the trolley problem places greater emphasis on being personally implicated in an impossible choice by asking whether you would push someone off a bridge to stop a trolley that would otherwise run over individuals on the track. The idea here is that the experience of having to personally push someone off a bridge to their death would be a far worse experience than pulling a lever, so that would constitute a higher bar to action over inaction. There are, by now, countless variations on the theme of the trolley problem. It's become sufficiently widely known that there are also a great many joke versions of the trolley problem. In other words, the trolley problem has become a meme. We're going to find that in these thought experiments in civilization that there are also countless variations on any given thought experiment. These variations are opportunities to probe the problem we are confronting in greater detail, perhaps yielding a more finely grained conclusion. There are a great many thought experiments, not only in ethics, as with the trolley problem, but also in other branches of philosophy and in science as well. Einstein was particularly well known for his use of thought experiment. It's been said that as a young boy, Einstein imagined what it would be like to ride on a beam of light. And in later life, he proposed the equivalence principle, because you couldn't tell the difference. If you were in a closed off elevator with no windows, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between whether the elevator was accelerating in one direction and you were being pinned to the floor by that, or whether you were in the influence of the gravitational force of a planet or some other astronomical object. Einstein kept up his thought experiments, which became more detailed and more elaborate, and these helped him to make the breakthrough to general relativity. There are, in fact, so many thought experiments that some philosophers have taken to studying the thought experiment on their own merits, and we can draw from the literature to clarify our thought experiments in civilization. Roy Sorensen has defined a thought experiment as, quote, an experiment that purports to achieve its aim without benefit of execution, unquote. And he also added, quote, thought experiments evolved from experiments by attenuation of the execution element and elaboration of the design element, unquote. Julian Baggini and Peter Fossel, in their widely available book, The Philosopher's Toolkit, wrote of thought experiments, quote, "The aim of a scientific thought experiment is to isolate the crucial variables, the factors which, if present, cause a certain effect that would not occur in their absence and does occur in their presence. Thought experiments are based on the same principles. The difference is that the variables being tested in a thought experiment need not or cannot, for whatever reason, actually be isolated. Rather, the variables are altered merely in imagination," unquote. Already in these two discussions of thought experiments, we find a difference in emphasis, with Sorensen emphasizing experimental design and Baggini and Fossel emphasizing the isolation of a crucial variable. These two accounts are in no way contradictory, since thought experiments can have many functions, and thought experiments themselves may be as different as experiments in biology and experiments in physics. We can also think of thought experiments, as I prefer to think of them, as thinking under controlled conditions, or as disciplined thinking with an explicit aim. We can make our aim more explicit by clarifying exactly what it is we're trying to do in a thought experiment, but we can't necessarily start out that way. As we saw with Einstein, who was developing thought experiments throughout his entire life, it can take time and effort to converge on an effective thought experiment. A thought experiment is, or ought to be, an iterative process. Our first thought experiments intended to investigate anything are likely to be a bit awkward and clumsy, but what we learn from them and what we learn from them will be limited. But one of the important lessons that we do learn is how to improve our thought experiments going forward. From the first attempts at thought experiments and the perception of their inadequacy, we can build toward greater adequacy by making more of the controlled conditions of our thought experiment explicit. Thought experiments should also be an iterative process in the sense that continuing to build on the results of previous thought experiments can take us outside our conceptual comfort zone and make it possible for us to entertain concepts we literally couldn't have previously grasped. Say we start a thought experiment, and following its logic, we formulate a new concept that is related to a familiar concept, perhaps a folk concept with which we began. But the new concept that we formulated as a result of our thought experiment is at the far edge of what's conceivable for us. That novel concept that we form from the first thought experiment can then be made the focus of a new thought experiment. And by pursuing variations on the theme of this new thought experiment, we may be able to formulate a new concept that is, once again, at the far edge of relatedness to where we began. The more times we can iterate this process, the further we can push our thinking into unfamiliar territory, the terra incognita of the mind, and that is where we learn something. Einstein, with his thought experiments, was working within the well-defined conceptual space of theoretical physics. If we're interested in explicating the concept of civilization, we must do so without any kind of well-defined conceptual space. In effect, that means we have to make up the discipline of the study of civilization as we go along. Given this disability of starting without an established science of civilization, what can we reasonably hope to achieve through thought experiments in civilization? What we often discover from thought experiments is that we don't know how to think about things. A really puzzling thought experiment shows us an ellipsis in our cognition, so that we can't bring any familiar ideas to bear on making sense of a problem. A paradoxical thought experiment remains a problem for us, and that's why it's interesting. Being forced to recognize an ellipsis in our thought usually means that we begin to ask questions that we haven't previously thought to ask, and that widens our inquiry, and sometimes it also deepens our inquiry. Someday, it may allow us to fill the ellipses in our thought with concepts that will further clarify our inquiry and contribute to a more adequate conceptual framework, which is why I said earlier that if we push an iterated thought experiment, it literally will make it possible for us to conceptualize something that was previously beyond our ability to conceptualize. We'll probably never achieve an exhaustive understanding of any object of knowledge, but it's the drive to completeness and consistency, that is to say, the drive to methodological fulfillment, that fuels the intellectual curiosity that keeps us asking questions and keeps us trying to answer them. Sometimes we have to experience the Socratic pain of realizing that we know nothing before we can make progress. In other words, we have to reach conceptual rock bottom before we can pick ourselves up and move forward. Consider the alternative. Suppose we came up with a definition of civilization that satisfied everyone. Then we would have an agreed upon concept of civilization, but what comes next? Would everything else just follow automatically from that point if we agree on a definition? No, it wouldn't. Concepts have to be systematically related to other concepts and embedded within a conceptual framework for us to be able to make use of them as an analytical tool. The concept of civilization must be set in the context of other concepts for it to be meaningful and to be of any use to us. Developing the concept of civilization goes hand in hand with developing the concepts that cluster around the concept of civilization. In this process of conceptual exploration, expansion, and clarification, we can hope to prepare ourselves for a more systematic inquiry into the nature of civilization. So what can we look forward to in this series of thought experiments in civilization? Since I'm going to be using an imaginative methodology, not only will I consider counterfactuals, I'll also consider future scenarios and some completely fictitious scenarios that don't even make a pretense to representing a future state of our civilization. An imaginative scenario involving a civilization or civilizations past, present, or future, actual or fictional, human or alien, any and all will be considered fair game for our thought experiments. As I said earlier, we can explore the concept of civilization in this way, and in exploring the concept of civilization, we may open up possibilities for research that might not have otherwise occurred to us. Exploring the concept of civilization may help us to clarify the concept of civilization and its limits, of which I spoke earlier. We can also extend, elaborate, and clarify the conceptual framework that we use to think about civilization. I'm not going to be formulating a thought experiment in civilization today, since today is only an introduction to the idea of thought experiments employed as a method of conceptual clarification and the extension of our conceptual framework. But the next episode in Thought Experiments in Civilization will introduce a thought experiment that I call the Early Modern Science of Civilization thought experiment. So thanks for listening, and see you in the next episode.